I have with me a guest today that I have wanted you to meet for a long time. He has been in the criminal justice system even longer than me, probably about 50 years. And he has been everything from a cop to an author to media relations. He was really involved in something near and dear to me that we're going to talk about soon. But Len Sipes, welcome to the show.
Betsy, it's really a pleasure to be here.
So
Happy to be here.
Let's talk about, first of all, how did you come to be part of the law enforcement profession?
I applied as a cadet for the Maryland State Police when I was 18, and I've been in the justice system in one way, shape, or form since the age of 18. So I was in law enforcement for about 4 years, decided to go to college, came out and did a couple more years of policing in Baltimore City. And from there, I went to the Department of Justice's clearinghouse as the senior specialist for crime prevention. From there, I went to the National Crime Prevention Council as their director of public information. And from there, I went to the Maryland Department of Public Safety for 14 years as the person in charge of media relations for this ungodly huge bureaucracy, law enforcement plus corrections plus everything else under the face of the earth. And from there, I went to the federal government.
So I want to talk about law enforcement and media relations in a minute, because that's a huge part of what we do at the National Police Association.
Yes.
We're trying to fight that false narrative.
Yes.
That somehow American law enforcement is the problem. But first, I want to go back to something that's just really personal to me, and something you and I were talking about off camera. And that is the National Crime Prevention Council's McGruff program.
Yep. Take a bite out of crime.
Talk about the birth of McGruff and what that meant to you.
Well, I was with Saatchi & Saatchi was the world's largest advertising agency at the time, and my job was to feed the creatives at Saatchi & Saatchi, to feed them statistics and research on crime and crime prevention or crime across the board. And they took a liking to me, and I took a liking to them. And they said, "How would you like to learn advertising?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd love to learn advertising." So I was in media relations and talking to the media first for the National Criminal Justice Reference Service and then the National Crime Prevention Council. But they sat down with me on a variety of occasions and basically said, "Look, we're going to be introducing McGruff. We're going to be developing McGruff. First of all, you need to understand advertising so you can help us better." And our job was to basically figure out what McGruff's message was going to be, how McGruff's message would play out. So they would have ideas, I would push back. I would have ideas, they would push back. And these were some of the most creative people on the face of the earth. And I said to myself that my real goal in life is to stay in media relations or even advertising, because it's such a creative endeavor that I really enjoyed. But the whole idea was to figure out how McGruff should communicate with the country.
And he did an amazing job. I mean, I can't think of anything more iconic when we talk about crime prevention than McGruff, the crime dog, right?
We had at that point the most popular public service advertising campaign in America, even bigger than Smokey the Bear. So it was just an amazing amount of media. Television stations, radio stations were running our ads. The print media were running our ads. All pro bono, all contributed. And from that, we ended up in thousands of conversations with media throughout the country and throughout the world in terms of crime in America, what was going on in the United States, how McGruff was supposed to help law enforcement and help community organizations deal with crime in their own communities. And at the same time, we got to travel around the country. We were invited into cities throughout the country and to sit down with their folks and try to help them figure out their crime problems. So for a young man, it was just an extraordinary experience.
Well, and I'll tell you, for a young crime prevention sergeant, the National Crime Prevention Council, and especially the McGruff program, was absolutely invaluable in helping us reach our communities, and every police department, had a McGruff costume. We all
Yes.
I had stuffed McGruff on my desk, and
Yeah.
we would go to different events. And you hear so much, Len, now about from activists and kind of the people who vilify law enforcement. We need community policing. How long have we had community policing in this country, Len?
Community policing has always been a part of law enforcement. We've known for decades and decades that without the community, we're not going to be effective in terms of dealing with the crime problem. You go to criminology, and I've taught criminology, and one of the things that you come to grips with, and was sort of startling when I took criminology, was that cops really are limited in terms of what it is that they can do. It's communities that control crime. It's, the cops can't stop you from beating your wife. I mean, that's a societal issue. And that's something we should condemn strongly in terms of spousal abuse. But we can't stop that. We can't stop people from taking drugs. We can't stop people from buying stolen items. There's a whole mess of things that we cannot do. We're limited. Without the community, we're sort of lost in terms of overall crime control. But my point is that overall crime control is not the sole responsibility of law enforcement. Without citizens controlling what happens in their own communities, we're not going to get anywhere. So we've known this for a long time, and we've understood this for a long time. Getting back to this issue with the perception of law enforcement, so I write on a fairly regular basis, and fortunately or unfortunately, I post my stuff on social media, and I get pushback all the time. Look, our detractors are not going to be supportive of us. But what the piece of research that I put out from the U.S. Department of Justice, about 54 million citizen contacts, and the vast majority of people like us. I mean, you take a look at Gallup, you take a look at Pew, you take a look at research from the Department of Justice, the overwhelming majority of people, citizens in the United States, strongly support law enforcement. It is one of the most trusted organizations in the United States, much further up the list than Congress, much further up the list than the media. So, we have detractors. So what? I mean, it's, and I understand what's been happening, I think, over the course of the last decade. And I think a lot of cops throughout the country have taken it to heart. And I keep reminding everybody that I talk to through my writing that the overwhelming majority of the American citizens like, trust, respect law enforcement. And the data, 54 million contacts, 2% involved force. I mean, it goes against the stereotype that we have out there. There was a piece of research in terms of police shootings of African Americans. And Statistica did it. And so they asked people, what do you think how many police officer involved shootings with unarmed African Americans are there in the United States in any given year? So your different organizations have different pieces of research. And there's about 20, 25, something along those lines. And that's not to say the shootings weren't justified just because the person was unarmed. But regardless, so they ask average citizens, well, what do you think that actual number is? And whether you were a Republican or whether you were a Democrat, it didn't matter. The overwhelming majority vastly overstated what they thought it was. 1,000 a year, 5,000 a year, 10,000 a year. So, we've come from the last 10 years where law enforcement has been viciously vilified, and that has gotten into the rank and file. That's why, per another article I did from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that we've lost tens of thousands of police officers in the last couple of years. I've talked personally to a lot of police officers and simply said, that's it. If society is going to turn against me, I'm out. And so we're losing tons of police officers, and that has an enormous impact on crime control. It has an enormous impact on fear of crime. And I keep telling officers over and over and over again, in person and through my writings and phone calls, that the vast majority of the American public is with you. It doesn't care. The demographics don't care whether you're black, white, Asian, rich, poor. The great majority of Americans support law enforcement. So, you know, try to keep that in perspective. That's what I'm telling individual officers. Try to keep that in perspective. You're thinking that America has turned against us within the justice system. No, they have not.
That is so well said. Why do you think this false narrative is so pervasive in society? Where does this come from? We all know, I mean, we know the facts. Why do you think so many people have it so wrong?
You know, if you take a look at, and this is another point that I try to bring up, if you take a look at institutions, Americans have a gut mistrust of institutions, whether it be the media, whether it be Congress, whether it be the medical profession, whether it be business. Americans have an innate mistrust of bureaucracies. They have an innate mistrust of anybody who holds power over them and could possibly influence their lives. So the fact that some Americans are mistrustful of law enforcement, well, you know, those same Americans are going to say, I don't trust the medical profession, or I don't trust the church any longer, which is tragic, or I don't trust any entity out there. So it's not just law enforcement. You know, from the very beginning, and I like to think that I'm a student of American history, all throughout the foundations of this country, mistrust of bureaucracies, especially the British bureaucracy, was steadfast and deeply ingrained into the American psyche. So if there's anything Americans don't like, it's large bureaucracies. But having said that, you take a look at polling research, and law enforcement is much more trusted than just about any other entity out there. I think it's small businesses and nurses, and then law enforcement. And there's a lesson there too, because Americans may mistrust the medical profession, but they don't mistrust the practitioners who work within the medical system, i.e. nurses. So Americans may mistrust bureaucracies, but they do seem to trust cops.
Right. What do you think is one of your many areas of expertise is media relations? What can American law enforcement leaders do better to fight this false narrative?
You know, how many times on a shift have individual law enforcement officers saved somebody's life? How many times did they perform CPR? How many lost kids did they find? Why we're not collecting that information on every daggone shift and broadcasting it is completely beyond my comprehension. So law enforcement needs to understand that they have the power through their own television shows, through their own radio shows, through their own podcast, through their own email list, to get the word out about what they are doing within that community. And more and more law enforcement agencies are doing it. I'm really surprised as to I've been championing this this concept for a long time, and I think more and more law enforcement agencies are doing it, and I think they really need to continue it. But for those law enforcement agencies that are not, they're making a big mistake. You've got to constantly show the value of law enforcement. You've got to constantly express the humanity of law enforcement. You know, I had this long conversation with somebody who started out, well, cops are bullies. Bullies become cops. And it's like, you know, dude, some of the gentlest human beings, some of the nicest human beings, some of the most mannerly human beings I have ever met have been cops. You know, why you have a need to say this is completely beyond my comprehension. Then I go back to the research. And then I go back to the Gallup polls and the Pew organization polls and other polls and the U.S. Department of Justice research. You know, cops are brutal. Well, if cops are brutal, out of 54 million contacts, 2% involve force or use of force. Not force, either the threat of force or the use of force. 2%. I mean,
dive into that a little, would you? Because I really want the citizens watching this to understand exactly what you mean by that. 54 million contacts, and yet 2% force or use of force. What's our definition for that?
Well, our definition is you have to at times say, as I've said to people when I was a law enforcement officer, sir, either we can do this the soft way and I can treat you like a gentleman, or if you try to hurt me, I'm going to hurt you back.
Right.
Okay, I just threaten force. But that was a tactic I used. The 90% of the people, if they're dealt with that way, complied.
That's called de-escalation.
It was de-escalation. That's exactly right. But that was a threat of force. So, it's police officers, I think, are out there dealing with increasing crime, increasing disorder, and yet the overwhelming majority, there is no force. I mean, 2%, for the love of heavens. Now, in terms of police initiated contacts, it's 3%. Big whoop. So, if you take a look at the data is extremely supportive of the average police officer in terms of his or her tour of duty, in terms of his or her doing the right thing. I mean, they were also talking about disrespect. 1%. 54 million contacts, 1% said that they were disrespected in one way, shape, or form by their encounter, that the overwhelming majority of police officers treated them well, that, an 88% overall satisfaction rate. This is law enforcement. This is not, you're not running a restaurant. This is law enforcement. 88% saying, yeah, they did a good job. For the love of heavens, the data is clearly on our side. So, we need to embrace who we are and what we are, and understand that the public likes us and trusts us as long as we don't do something outrageously stupid.
What do you attribute this, and it is a small percentage, but it's a visible percentage, of just utter lawless behavior by citizens? We see the videos out of New York and Buffalo and LA and Seattle and Portland and in my native Chicago and Baltimore and on and on and on. What do you attribute that to?
Look, the issue is crime increasing and decreasing, and throughout our country's history, there are times of disorder, and there are times where disorder decreases considerably. Everything is in a state of flux. Everything has a way of increasing and decreasing, and criminologists couldn't give you a precise answer. But my fear is that with all the police officers leaving, and with all the issues and all the controversies, like say bail, I think citizens and bad people come to understand that, okay, the cops aren't being as aggressive as they once were. And you take a look at the data from that Department of Justice report, a 60% decline in searches, a 60% decline in searches, traffic stops going from 9 to 7%, police initiated action decreasing by 1%. So, the stories were the jails, we're going to empty the jails, we're going to empty the prisons because of COVID. I think that sends a pretty clear message to the bad folks out there that law enforcement and the entire justice system is no longer going to be as stringent as they once were. That's sort of like giving them a green light to commit crime. So, I think the message to the bad folks is that we're no longer the system that we were for COVID for lots of different reasons. All of the bad publicity over the course of the last 10 years. So maybe we can get away with more. And I think the message society is throwing out there is that maybe the risk of being a criminal is not as strong as it used to be.
Right. If you're not going to go to prison, and indeed, if you're not, maybe not even going to go to court for committing bad acts, what's to deter you, right? I mean, that's the whole point of the criminal justice system is deterrence. And you said something a couple of minutes ago, so important, that cops cannot solve all of society's ills.
Absolutely not. A cop can't be all things to all people. Right. I think that's the message that I constantly give to people writing editorials or that sort of thing. Cops cannot be all things to all people. It's just impossible for law enforcement to do everything. But law enforcement, unfortunately, is tasked with doing everything because they're the only people out there at 3 o'clock in the morning.
That's absolutely
so, that mental health call, that's going to go to cops because nobody else is available to handle that individual. And we have a society where it is a new article that I have, and not quite sure I sent it to you, that the majority of people involved in accidents are under the influence of drugs.
Mhm.
The majority of people arrested are under the influence of drugs or alcohol. The majority of people in accidents, serious accidents, are under the influence of drugs and alcohol. If you add mental health to that issue, if you add mental instability, I mean, how cops can do what they do, and yet citizens, when they're polled, only 2% force or threat of force, to me is amazing.
Right.
It's literally amazing as to how good cops are being. That's not to take away from the fact that we make mistakes, and then that's not to take away from the fact that we sometimes really go overboard to the point where it's criminal. There are certain points where we have to own our own mistakes, but by and large, the overwhelming majority of the police officers out there seem to be doing the right thing, and citizens are basically saying, yeah, they pretty much do the right thing.
Lenk, where can people find you, find your articles, find out more about you?
I own and operate crimeinamerica.net. So anybody can contact me through crimeinamerica.net. If you want to email me, I'll be hit with bogus emails, but Leonard, Leonard, Sipes, Sipes @gmail.com. And through the social media platforms that I interact with on a regular basis.
Thank you so much for being with us today. And if you would like more information about the National Police Association, visit us at nationalpolice.org.
Sam, put the gun down! Put the gun down!
Last year, law enforcement officers were involved in hundreds of thousands of use of force incidents. A use of force incident is when an officer must use nonverbal tactics to gain control of a dangerous situation.
Put the knife on the ground.
In many cases, officers have no choice but to use force when a suspect doesn't comply with a lawful order.
Use of force is always ugly. No one likes it, especially police officers.
Together, we can help de-escalate these dangerous encounters. Help police officers by complying with their lawful orders. Don't attack, attempt to disarm, or flee from an officer.
Use of force is an officer's last option. Most incidents can be avoided by not resisting arrest.
If you feel you've been wrongfully detained by a police officer, then seek a legal solution after the encounter has been resolved.
Let's keep everyone safe. Comply now and complain later.